Welcome to Athenaeum Spotlight. I'm your host, Guy McLain, and I'm here with Mark Auerbach. How are you doing today?
Hey, good morning, Guy. How are things at the Athenaeum?
Very good, very good. Very busy. We're having a very busy fall, which is really nice. People are coming in. We've got a lot of programs, so things are going very, very well.
You know, I noticed in the Westfield News in the last day or two that the Athenaeum got a grant, a huge grant.
Yes, we got a grant for the Mass Humanities for a little bit over $10,000. This is going to allow us to upgrade and improve our history exhibits. We're in the process of really doing a major overhaul of the way we present history, the history of Westfield in the Athenaeum. We're designing completely new exhibit cases. We're going to bring in artifacts that have never been shown before from the collection. We've got a whole array of changes that are going to come about, and I'm very excited about this because I think that some of our exhibits were a little dated and hadn't been changed for quite a while, and this will give us a chance to bring in kind of a fresh perspective on Westfield history. I think some of the stories that are most fascinating in the history of the Westfield community have not been told, and this is going to give us a chance to bring a kind of a new perspective to that story.
And people are wondering, everything's up and running at the Athenaeum now. You're back to your regular hours. Are people coming? I know you did a lot of curb service librarian stuff.
Yes.
A lot of phone tutorials and references. But are people now back? Is it really back to normal?
Yeah, it really is back to normal. I mean, the only real change that you see is everybody's wearing a mask. But we're open our regular hours. We're open all the way till 8 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Thursday. We've got Saturday hours. People are coming in for programming. They're doing all the things that people were going to libraries for in the past. And it's great to see that because I think many people miss the services we had to offer. People rely on libraries for resumes. People working on maybe putting together a resume. Librarians many times help people. Many times people don't have computers, so the Athenaeum can provide a computer that they can work on their resume. People needing documents from the government, or people just needing information. Students coming in, working on theme papers. Those are all the things that happen every day at the Athenaeum, and now we're back in operation. It's great to see.
That's great. It's good for all of us. A couple of weeks ago, you and I had a chance to go to a world premiere of a show called A Crossing at Barrington Stage. It was the story of immigrants crossing the border from Mexico to the United States. It was a totally sung and danced through musical, although the music was new and some of it was inspired by Mexican folk music. It had a very Broadway sound to it, and it was directed and choreographed by Joshua Bergas, who is the up-and-coming theater director. It's called A Crossing. Really wonderful. But between your arts going and mine, we've covered a lot of ground on our own in the last few weeks. I understand that you just got back from the Metropolitan Opera in New York.
Yes, this last weekend I had the opportunity to go into the city. It was great to be back in New York. I hadn't been in New York for almost 2 years because, of course, the COVID restrictions. So it was great to get back in the city. And the Metropolitan right now has put together a brand new opera by a black composer, the very first time in the 130-year history of the Metropolitan Opera that they've actually done an opera that was written by a black composer and has an all-black cast. And it was really very special. It was a grand production, really well staged, and it was great to see the crowd there, enjoying opera because I really missed it. I hadn't been to an opera in over 2 years, and boy, I was ready to go.
And the composer is Terence Blanchard. And what's the name of the opera?
The name of the opera is "Fire Shut Up in My Bones," which is, and it was a troubling theme. The theme was about a young boy who is abused as a child and grows up and tries to deal with all these experiences in his youth. and it's very touching. It's very moving. I think there was a lot of people shedding tears at this opera because of the nature of the material. But it wasn't all kind of a negative, depressing theme. There was dance. There was some wonderful dance sections, beautiful music. It was a really interesting opera on a very contemporary theme, and I think that's something that many people don't realize. I mean, most operas that you go to at the Metropolitan or other opera houses were written 100, 150 years ago. So it was nice to see a brand new production. And what's interesting about Terence Blanchard, anybody who's seen Spike Lee's movie has probably heard his music, because he's written most of the music that is used for Spike Lee's movies. He's the movie composer for him. And he comes out of a jazz tradition, and that was a very interesting
aspect. He's a
aspect.
trumpeter, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
His instrument's trumpet.
Interestingly enough, there's a new performing arts series generating out of Florence, Massachusetts, called Bombix, and Terence Blanchard is on their opening season lineup later this fall.
That's interesting.
I don't have all the details on it yet. I'm going to be interviewing the people from Bombix on an upcoming Arts Beat program, but this new series that is starting, it's at the Florence Congregational Church in Florence, and will not only feature Terence Blanchard, but the great American jazz singer Dee Dee Bridgewater, who got a Tony Award back in the 70s. She played Glinda the Good Witch in the musical The Wiz.
Oh.
And then she went to Europe and developed this phenomenal jazz career. So Terence Blanchard is out on the road touring and traveling. It'd be interesting to see him performing with his own band after creating what will be probably a masterpiece for the Met.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's interesting. And I read several interviews before I went to the opera with Terence Blanchard, and it's very, he talked about how feeling the weight of being asked to write this opera for the Metropolitan, being the first black composer to do that in its entire history. And I think what a burden that must have felt like for him to kind of represent the black community. But one of the things he said is, even though I may be the first, it's my goal to write something that has the quality so that I'm not the last black composer to write for the Metropolitan. And I think based on the production he put together, the opera he put together, it was very successful. I think we're going to see more composers coming out of a tradition that's not necessarily the typical opera classical music tradition. People coming from other traditions like jazz, because I think there's a lot of room for that in opera, and we can think of other examples that have been very successful. George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess is an example of an opera that has kind of a similar type of approach to the opera tradition, and I think Terence Blanchard has added another piece that'll go down with Porgy and Bess as a great American opera.
Well, I ran down to Goodspeed Musicals last week to see, it's called A Grand Night for Singing. It's a review of Rodgers and Hammerstein music. And, they wrote The King and I and Oklahoma and South Pacific and a lot of the real canon of American musical theater. But they also wrote some shows that were flops, that you had great music and you've just never heard of, and some moderate successes. So this review, maybe 2 hours long, it was nice to be back at Goodspeed again, featured a lot of the music, but not in necessarily traditional settings. We Kiss in a Shadow from The King and I, which was the slave and her forbidden boyfriend singing. This was sung by a gay couple. And taken out of context of the shows and presented with some swing arrangements and some jazz arrangements and given new twists and turns and everything. The music could have been written last week. It's some of it's almost 100 years old, and it holds up as though it was written yesterday. And I used to think if somebody said, do you want to go see a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical? I could think of a million other things I'd rather do. But seeing it in hearing the music out of context in a different format. These songs are great songs.
Yeah. I think in many ways, Rodgers and Hammerstein, even though sometimes they could be a little, Broadway musicals at that time could get a little sentimental or a little maybe overdone at times. But I think they wrote some really interesting music, and they really worked at the height of Broadway, when Broadway maybe was at one of its golden eras. The time when Bernstein was writing West Side Story, and other musicals were coming out, My Fair Lady, and several other musicals that were really very good. But I think this illustrates one of the problems with doing either a really good musical or an opera, which are really very similar in many ways. The difference between a musical and an opera many times is not that great.
Well, I was going to say, I went with a friend of mine, and who I go to the theater with a lot, and we were talking, and I made mention of opera. He's never been to an opera. And he said, well, I would know. I said, well, the Met streams a lot of their operas in movie theaters. So you could go see this Terence Blanchard opera be screened. I know at the Mahawi in Great Barrington, and I believe the Amherst Cinemas, and a couple of other places in town show them high def, widescreen at the movies, and stuff. I said, so you could do your first opera experience in a movie theater nearby. And I said, but opera and musicals aren't that much different, like Porgy and Bess or Sweeney Todd. That fits in either the opera house or the musical theater, or West Side Story.
Yeah.
And in the European opera houses, of which there are so many, you have the American musicals like Kiss Me, Kate, or West Side Story are part of the canon of Porgy and Bess, along with La Boheme and Carmen. Everything else we're here.
Yeah, it's very strange. American opera houses tend to do more of the traditional operas, but European opera houses that are actually much more active than American opera houses will do musicals as well as the traditional operas. And why not? I mean, it's great musical theater with great music. Why not do it?
And there is this video floating around on YouTube. It is one of the German opera houses that presented Leonard Bernstein's Candide, which is really could fall opera or musical theater.
Yes.
But it's got a very famous aria called Glitter and Be Gay, which Barbara Cook introduced. And it is a coloratura aria about a woman who can't leave her jewels behind and everything. And this was done in a German thing where the Cunegonde, the singer, was dressed up like Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in the movie, with the guys dancing, a row of guys behind her. It was one of the most fascinating stagings of something that's very traditional, and it came out of the European the mix of musical theater and opera.
Well, getting back to an opera like Porgy and Bess, I think one of the best operas written in America by a composer who wasn't really thought of. He was thought more of as a Broadway composer, not as an opera composer, but yet he wrote this great opera, Porgy and Bess. And I think one thing that's very interesting about that, I mean, from my own experience is I've never seen it done by an American opera house. Where I saw it done in Copenhagen, Denmark, and that says something that European opera houses are doing these American productions many times more than Americans have done it. The Metropolitan has only done Porgy and Bess one time, which I think is kind of a crime. I mean, I think we all ought to send nasty letters to the Metropolitan saying you should do Porgy and Bess again because it's long overdue.
Well, they should. And Porgy and Bess was my first experience with opera at the Houston Grand Opera.
Yes.
And their production of Porgy and Bess ended up going to Broadway, and of all places. And it won Tony Awards. It got a couple of Tony Awards, and then made the national tour, not to the opera houses, but to the Broadway theaters.
Right.
And I think you and I we both worked in Houston at various points in our careers. And I don't know if you ever saw, the Houston Grand Opera is probably one of the best opera companies in America.
And I love the opera house. It's a great place to hear opera. They the acoustics are wonderful in the Houston Grand Opera. If people are traveling to Houston and there's and they're doing a production, I really recommend to people to go to that, because the Houston Grand Opera, I actually like that opera house better than the Metropolitan in New York. It's more the stage is easier to see, and the acoustics are better.
Well, when I worked in Houston, that opera house was under construction, and the opera house that they used was a theater called Jones Hall.
Yes.
When the opera wasn't performing there, the ballet was performing there, or the symphony, and in between were Broadway shows, and it had the ambiance of a bus station. And at the time, people would go to the opera because it was the social thing to do. So you get all dressed up, and the intermissions were unbelievably long, so you could stroll the lobby and drink and everything else and socialize, and then rush back in and see the next act of the opera. But Porgy and Bess changed that for Houstonians when their opera company became famous around the world. And the new opera house that they have, the Wortham Theater Center, although it was very much destroyed in the hurricane a couple of years ago, has been restored and back. And it's a city that appreciates its culture on a lot of levels.
Yeah, very surprisingly, I think for many people in the Northeast, they don't realize that Houston has some great museums, has a great symphony orchestra, and a great opera company. So it's kind of surprising, I think, to a lot of people who are not familiar with Houston. It's quite amazing what they're doing, and it's very interesting. Going back to Porgy and Bess, the reason that the Metropolitan Opera decided to do Porgy and Bess is because the Houston Grand Opera had done such a great production that it received so much positive attention that the Met felt like they had to do it after the Houston Grand Opera had been so successful with their production.
Well, the thing that I think about when I think of the arts in Houston, it's very similar to the arts here in Western Massachusetts. For the most part, people are appreciative of what they have, and we have some really good theater companies. And we have a good symphony orchestra, which I hope can get back on its feet. It's involved in labor dispute.
Yes.
And get back. But when they're performing, Kevin Rhodes and those musicians are really top class on every single level there is. And we've got good dance at Jacob's Pillow. And, of course, we have Tanglewood and all that. So we're all very lucky to be in an environment that has great performing and visual arts. I mean, you couldn't ask for better museums.
Right. And then also just a little bit, if you want to go a little bit beyond Western Mass, the Hartford Symphony is very good, and there's also some very good theater productions in Hartford. And then the Albany Symphony, Albany, New York. The Albany Symphony is doing wonderful things these days with American music. They've had a policy in the last number of years to perform at least one work by an American composer, living American composer, on every concert. And so if you go to an Albany Symphony concert, you're going to hear something done by a recent American composer, which is really exciting. They put together some great programs comparing the older masterpieces to newer works by American composers, and that's also very good.
I got to admit, I've been on the planet for quite a while. I've never been to Albany, New York.
Oh, really? Well. I think the Albany Symphony, you should really go to the Albany Symphony because I think they're one of the most progressive orchestras in the United States right now, and it's just less than an hour and a half away from us, so it's not a difficult trip at all.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to Saratoga to the Performing Arts Center, and I've been to the Glimmerglass Opera and the Lake George Opera, but I've driven through Albany. I've just not gotten off the Northway or whatever they call it.
Well, and Glimmerglass, that's another. I'm glad you brought up Glimmerglass because that's a little further away, but definitely an easy day trip. And in the summer, they have wonderful opera there. I've seen some great productions there as well.
Now, switching back to the Athenaeum, where we should put a spotlight for a second.
Yes. Okay.
You brought back art exhibitions.
Yes.
This fall.
Yes, we've got a great exhibition ongoing right now with the work of Ensign Russell, an artist who's lived in the Westfield area for several decades. But she's got a very interesting background. She grew up in Korea, married an American serviceman in the 1970s. They came first to California, where she completed her arts education, and then they moved to Westfield, and they've lived in Westfield for quite some time now. And her show is just fascinating. She does these wonderful collages, using this special rice paper, and she builds up these wonderful canvases that look like jungle or forest scenes, and they're just fascinating works of art. So I recommend to everyone to get out to see that exhibit, because it's only up through the end of October. It's I think it's an exhibit that everyone wants to get in to get in to see before it closes. We also have another great show after that one. It's called The Untold Stories: The Art of the Westfield Athenaeum. We're going to look at many of the artists who've worked in the Westfield area over the last 150 years. And that story is not only going to be an interesting story about the artist in Westfield, but it's also going to be an interesting story about the history of Westfield, because the artists in many ways reflect the history of the city.
Let me ask you a question. This may be a silly question, but when you go to the Athenaeum to see an exhibit, it's free, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely, yes. The Rand Gallery, which is, by the way, we're very fortunate in Westfield that the Athenaeum, when they built an extension off the old library in 1927, they included this area for an art gallery, and it's a really beautiful, nice space to exhibit art. And so people, if you come in right in the front door, it's just to the right there. It's very close to the circulation desk. And anytime the library is open, the art gallery is open as well, which is really nice. Many art galleries are not open as much as public libraries are, so you can get by in the evening or on the weekends to see this wonderful exhibit.
That's terrific. And you have a website, and I know you're on Facebook.
Yes.
But you also have a website that has all these programs, everything from, getting computer assistance to book clubs and all of that. Where can people find out about the Athenaeum?
Well, I recommend going to and checking our website very, very often because we have so many programs that you want to check it out on a regular basis. And that's the address is WestAth. WESTATH.org. And I think it's a good thing for, Westfield residents to check that out on a regular basis, because there's all kinds of different programs on that.
Okay.
Okay, so we probably should stop and take a break.
Yeah.
Take a brief break to acknowledge the underwriters who make programming like the Athenaeum Spotlight possible on Westfield Community Programming 15, Southwick Community Programming, and 88.9 FM WSKB. Peter Cowles is our chief engineer, and we'll be right back.
Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield.
Underwriting for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Westfield, serving the youth of the Whip City and surrounding communities since 1969. For more information on the Great Futures Club for ages 3 to 5, happening weekdays, and the Club Teen Center for ages 11 and older, weekdays from 6:30 till 8 p.m., go online at bcgwestfield.org or visit the club at 28 West Silver Street. The Boys and Girls Club of Greater Westfield. Great futures start here.
This is Ken Stomsky from Ken's Den on WCPC 15 and 89.5 FM, Tuesdays, 8 to 10.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM, WSKB Westfield.
To Athenaeum Spotlight. I'm Mark Auerbach. Guy McLain is the curator and the executive director of the Westfield Athenaeum. And on the screen is Ben Dunham, who is a part-time Huntington, Massachusetts resident. Ben and I, our careers and our lives go back I hate to say it, almost like 50 years, Guy, because Ben was at the American Symphony Orchestra League in Washington, D.C., and their offices were on the grounds of Wolf Trap, which is where was my first professional job. And we met on the fields in front of the Feline Center at Wolf Trap, I'd say like 50 years ago, because this is the 50th anniversary season of Wolf Trap. Over the years from there, Ben has been a music administrator. He has been an editor with music trade papers like Chamber Music America. And he has a new book out called Etched in Memory, The Elevated Art of J. Alphege Brewer. It's now in paperback from wherever you buy your books. It's the first illustrated study of the life and works of J. Alphege Brewer, whose name I might be mispronounced, who was an early 20th century British artist who made etchings of large colored etchings of European cathedrals and stuff. And we got the book here.
Yes.
Which I can put up in the camera for you that Ben sent. And I had a great time looking through it. And I gave it to you to hang out with. And anyway, Ben, it's great to see you. And you turn your volume on, Ben.
I should have it on.
It is. How are you?
You hear it okay?
Yep.
Oh, good. It's a little bit of a delay, but I guess we're used to that.
Yeah, we are. I mean, in this wonderful world of Zoom, things just appear differently than they are.
Well, my wife, Wendy Rolfe, teaches flute at Berkeley College, and during COVID, she's had to deal with teaching classes, including ensemble classes, on Zoom. So we're familiar with the lag time.
Yeah. So the book is gorgeous, Ben, and obviously the artist's work is great. What made you decide, after being doing orchestra management and chamber music management, and then being a journalist, primarily in the world of classical music, what made you decide to write a book about etchings?
Well, I guess in your retirement, you're allowed to switch careers. And that's what happened to me. I retired, and somewhere along the line, we started to get interested in these etchings, which we had inherited a couple. Wendy's great-grandmother was married to this artist's brother as a second marriage. And so a couple of these etchings came down to us in the family. And I gave Wendy for a birthday one of his color etchings, which he was famous for doing, color etchings. And it's not the usual style of etching that people do. And I found out that you can buy them on eBay. And in those days, that was 2015, they were quite inexpensive. And so I started collecting them. And then I realized that I didn't know much about this fellow. Nobody does, or had known. And so I did a lot of research on that. And with the help of a dealer that I knew over in England, he said, well, why don't you do a website? So I started to put a website together, which I can show you later in the conversation, I hope. And so I started to collect all this information. And then I realized that there's nothing permanent about the internet. I mean, a lot of things that we wish had disappeared are still there, but we're not sure that things are going to be the same way we left them after we leave. And so the one way of preserving that is to have a book. And so I put together the information that was on the website into the book that you have now, with the hope that it will be cataloged and available in various art libraries and other libraries throughout the country. And it'll have the research won't be lost. That's the idea. it's about 5 years of research.
I think one thing that's very interesting about this, and I think this points out something that I definitely come in contact with at the Athenaeum, is that there are some really excellent artists out there that not a lot is known about, that did excellent work in maybe in a particular city or a particular region or something, and they're not, they're kind of forgotten about later on. We tend to think, oh, if you do great art, you'll be famous, but that's actually not the case. And it's one thing I found was very interesting as I looked through this book. I was very surprised that there wasn't more information, more knowledge about this artist out there, because he just does wonderful works. As I was looking through the book, I just was so impressed by the quality of his work, and so I think that's very interesting. Did you have a difficult time finding records and information on him?
Yes, there is almost no information on him, and a lot what's in the book is just from the what I've learned by collecting his etchings and viewing them and comparing them and coming to some conclusions. I have been lucky in getting in touch with other members of the family. Wendy, I guess, is one of the members of the family as a step great something or other niece. But other members of the family have been very helpful. Brewer and his wife didn't have any children, so we're all sort of in the same boat. And we don't. And if there are records, archives of his correspondence or anything like that, members of the family don't know about them. So this is all a totally original research. And it's been a lot of fun to put together.
Well, I'm glad you've done something like this. I mean, we really have to rely on people like you who come upon artwork many times by artists who did very interesting work, but is not very well known, and go into the trouble of putting this together, because that's the only way we can preserve information about these, many times these very excellent artists who just didn't quite get to the international level in terms of exposure and that sort of thing. And so, yeah. I really applaud your effort in doing this. And I have to say, it was really, really well done. Very, very interesting book.
What's interesting about Brewer, I think, is that his style of art is kind of out of fashion now. And he wasn't a futurist in any sense. His whole family was based on historical leanings. His grandfather edited the correspondence of Henry VIII. His father was an architectural artist. He was invited to do a painting of Queen Victoria in the mausoleum. So they were acquainted, and there are some wonderful stories about him. But his style of art, James's, is very out of fashion, and probably was retro even then. But it had tremendous impact because and you might have read this in the book. His main market was in the United States, and he became famous just as World War I started. And he got this idea that since he loved to do cathedrals, and that was all in his family background and everything, and if World War I started, and nobody was sure that it was going to start, but people thought if it did start here, that they knew sort of how it was going to start, that a lot of these wonderful old cathedrals and other medieval buildings were going to be threatened by the war, whatever happened. And there was enough information that people could understand that Belgium was going to be the attack point for the German invasion if it happened. And somehow he captured material, photographs or whatever. He was able to capture a whole bunch of buildings before they were bombed, so that he could make these etchings. So he had to have anticipated the war and the course of the war. You can almost follow the war through his etchings as they were released. And that was the great discovery for me. It was maybe 2 or 3 years into my collecting, and I said, wait a minute, all these buildings, these are some of the same places I read about when I'm reading about World War I. And sure enough, that's, and it's so, some of these etchings were not copyrighted. In those days, you had to copyright them both in Great Britain and in the United States. And his original ones were not copyrighted in the United States. And that meant that people could pounce on them and make copies at very low cost. You could say, well, they were stealing his work, but in fact, they were increasing his market. And guys, as you probably have read in the internet introduction, it is not unusual to run across people. If you say you collect these etchings of cathedrals, people will say, well, I have a cathedral etching in my attic or my basement. And it turns out, in a couple of cases that I'm familiar with, that these were hung on the wall. These were very low-cost reproductions of Breuer's etchings, but we know that they are by Breuer. And they were hung on the wall as a memento or a memorial for a member of a family of a soldier who was fighting on the Western Front. It's the discovery of that was just amazing for me. I have is it possible we could show a slide?
Peter, can we show some slides?
I can share. It says host disabled participant. You'd have to turn on your participant screen share.
We're set.
Yeah, you can do it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll share this one. There, can you see that now?
Yeah, with the title of Wonder Woman at the top of that.
Yes.
Yes.
That's this. You can see. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yes.
So that's Breuer, and that's his wife Florence, who was herself a quite a well-known watercolorist, and her whole family were involved in art and etchings. Her great uncle was David Lucas, who was the engraver for all of John Constable's artwork when it was released as when they were released as engravings. And then her grandfather was a landscape artist, and her father was a landscape artist, and she was well known as an artist herself. And so it was almost like a merger of families, the Lucas family and the Breuer family, and two of her brothers assisted him in making the etchings, because the whole family was trained as engravers. So it was quite an operation. There were 8 members of the family that or related people who were all involved in the production. If I stop this, let's see, and see what happened just then. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we just had a Ben Dunham sound and light show with lots of pictures of you crossing the screen. Ben, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Your whole world, creative and administrative, has been in classical music. Here you are working in the world of visual arts. Was it a transition for you? I mean, this is something a little out of your everyday kind of work to delve into art and write a book. Did you find it an adventure? Did you find it difficult compared to the usual kinds of work you do?
Yes, very much so. As you know, Mark, every field, people don't realize this, but every field has its own lingo, its own framework. And if you're in the music world, you know immediately you're talking to somebody who is in the music world. My wife and I find that all the time. And I'm quite sure that there are people in the art world who look at my involvement in this and say, gee, this guy really needs to go back to school or something. So yes, it was fun to learn all of this. Obviously, I read a lot of books about the whole process of etching and the other people who were involved in art at the time, and that was fun. And gradually, you pick up a little bit of the lingo. But that was exciting because if you have spent a whole career as we have in the music field, it's nice to shift gears and learn something new.
I have to ask one question though, because Mark and I are always talking about kind of the situation with the music and theater and the classical music in the world today, and especially in light of what's happened with the pandemic and so many symphony orchestras, chamber music groups, opera companies having to shut down for a long period of time, the financial problems like we're experiencing here in this region with the Springfield Symphony, the difficulties there. And I just have to ask you, because of your experience in the classical music world, where do you see the future of classical music in America going? Because I'm seeing, in some cases declining audiences. I'm really concerned about the future of performance in America, of classical music in America. And I wonder, given the fact that you've really been involved as an administrator with these, what is your experience, and what do you see happening in the future?
Well, do we have time for a whole nother show?
Yeah, we'll do a marathon show.
Yeah, because this is a big topic, isn't it? Yes.
Well, just briefly, and this is sort of my perspective. I bet Mark and I talked about this 50 years ago. But the music field in the music world in America started with Jenny Linden and other people touring from Europe. And it was always a kind of an elitist kind of operation. Even when it went out west and they were performing in the bar halls, it was not really deeply embedded into American society. And then it started to in the cultural generation just before the turn of the century. And of course it flourished. And I don't know if you know, because I worked for many years with the American Symphony Orchestra League, what it was that created the great explosion of orchestras in this country?
Probably when in the 1960s, when the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts came. No,
sir. It was the introduction of talkie movies.
Because of all the European composers.
Well, every town had its hall that were usually a larger hall that it had an orchestra that played along with the the movies. And when talkies came in, all these musicians were gainfully employed and they were gainfully unemployed, and so they started their own little orchestras in each town. That's why each town has its own orchestra and has since about 1930 or so.
I see. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, because like the Springfield Symphony was founded during World War II, which I think is kind of interesting that they were able to put that together.
The current Springfield Symphony was founded in 1944.
1944.
But there was a symphony prior to it.
There were actually two symphonies prior to that. One went back to the 19th century, and then there was another one in the 1920s. But the current symphony, you're right, 1944. Which is very interesting how, and this is what, Springfield being a city that probably, had a lot of those musicians that were working in the film, working with films and this sort of thing. But it seemed like to me that the real height of classical music in America was the 1950s, 1960s, that era, when there seemed to be more government support for the arts.
Well, I mentioned the end of the talkies, which had to do especially with small town orchestras. And then, of course, the immigration during and after World War II created a whole population of people who were acculturated and really loved this music. And you could, the the audience was a ready-made audience for 20, 30 years, and then we've, through music education and other outreach activities, we've been able to keep that audience alive. And I think you're right that we've been through that period, and we have all kinds of competing entertainment options for us. That's causing a problem for symphony orchestras. My wife being a symphony musician also, and she didn't play from the beginning of March 2020 to her first new performance was playing piccolo in Handel and Haydn performance on the Esplanade in late August, and she was just bereft from not being able to play. And I think your symphony musicians are exhibiting some of these same wanting to get together, wanting to perform.
Right.
I'll say what I've been watching is that some orchestras were better at keeping their musicians involved. New Bedford was very good about that, and others were not. Yeah. And so I think it will bounce back, but not all of the elements that we were just talking about are still there. So it's going to be a little bit of work.
Yeah, that's what my concern is. I really hope that symphony orchestras and chamber music groups can bounce back, because I worry a lot about that. There's not, one of the things that happened in Europe is the governments threw, billions of dollars towards supporting the arts, but that did not happen in the United States. And I really worry about the future of our arts organizations, given that reality in America.
But of course, the support in the United States is totally different from in Europe, because they don't have the private support. They have some corporate support, but they don't have the private support, and that's really the bedrock of art support in this country.
Gentlemen, we're going to take a quick break to acknowledge the underwriters that make On the Mark and Athenaeum Spotlight with Guy McLain possible on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15, and now Southwick Community Programming, as well as 89.5 FM WSKB. Before we go to break, Benjamin Dunham's book, Etched in Memory, The Elevated Art of J. Alfred Brewer, is available on Peacock Press. And I did a little trip to the internet to find out if I could find the book, and it's available wherever you go and seek out your books. So you'll get a chance to order and take a look at Ben's book.
And it's a really beautiful book.
It is. Peter Coles is our chief engineer this morning, and we'll be back after these underwriting announcements, so don't go away.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by Bay State Dental. Comprehensive dentistry at 14 convenient locations in Springfield, Chicopee, Longmeadow, West Springfield, Belchertown, East Longmeadow, Ludlow, Northampton, Greenfield, and Wilbraham, as well as 29 Broad Street in Westfield. Bay State Dental makes it a priority to help you achieve and maintain the healthy smile you deserve. On the web at baystatedental.com. Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield.
Listen to me, Michael Buster McMahon, Mondays 8 to 10 a.m. to learn the stories behind your favorite songs. Or don't. I'm not the boss of you.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to Athenaeum Spotlight, everyone. I'm Mark Auerbach. This is Guy McLain. We're chatting with Ben Dunham, who's the author of Etched in Memory, The Elevated Art of J. Alfred Brewer. Peter Coles is our chief engineer today. If you've missed a part of today's program or you want to rerun it or replay it, you'll find it on YouTube, archived at WSKB Community Radio. So, Ben, now that you've got this potential bestseller on your hands, what's your next book going to be?
I'm not sure. I don't have a ready book in mind. The way the publisher came to me, that was interesting because it was somebody I knew from the recorder. You know, I was involved in the world of the recorder for many years, and he called from England and he said, "Do you have any books for me?" He publishes mostly books on music and also beekeeping. So I said, no, I don't have any books on music, and I certainly don't have any books on beekeeping, but I have one on an artist. And with the name of your publishing house being Peacock Press, it seems like you'd be perfect for this publication. And he prints all of his books, this whole new way of printing them on demand, so that the author and the publisher don't have to invest tons and tons of money in order to get a book like this out. And you can order it. So let me see if I can share this screen with you. This would be here. So that's this is my website, and J.L. Fez Brewer, and I'm not sure if you can see up here. That's jlfezbrewer.info. That's one of those new codes. Instead of com or edu, it's info, which basically means it's just information. It's just research. And then see if this works here. This is a teaser for the book, and it should come up to there it is. This is the page that it takes you to. And this is how you can order the book: Babe Books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. And if you go to any of these sites, an order is going to be placed at a company called Ingram, which does print-on-demand books. In fact, this is my favorite one here, Indie Bound. Is this okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So look at this. I never knew about this before, but if you go to Indie Bound, you can order this from your local bookstore. You see?
Oh, that's great. So you can support your independent bookseller.
Exactly.
That's great, because we've got to keep those bookstores going.
Right.
People don't, they're happy to have Amazon, but for some specialty things, but they don't want,
Ben, you started collecting Brewer's etchings. Do you have enough to put an exhibition together?
Oh, I do. Yes, I do. When I realized that so many of these etchings were World War I etchings, I put together an exhibition at the Memorial Church at Harvard, which was doing a big observance in 2018 for the 100th anniversary centenary of the end of the World War I. And they have a memorial hall there with all the names of the Harvard students that died in World War I. And so these were on easels all around that room and were exhibited in that time. And then after that, they were moved to another exhibition at the World War I Museum in Kansas City. And that went on, that was for about 6 months exhibit there in their Ellis Gallery. And since then, I've added to the collection some of the World War I etchings that I didn't have before. And these are going to be exhibited on Veterans Day in my hometown, Marion. And I'm going to be giving a lecture there. So that'll be 3 exhibitions for them. There's another group that also could be exhibited if anybody wants to raise their hands. He did a whole series of blue hour etchings, which are, I don't know if you saw them in the book, but they're really extraordinary color of blue, iridescent blue. And there must be about 15 or 20 of those. And they're all cathedrals or churches in street scenes at the time when just after the sun has set. So the sky is starting to get blue, but it's not pitch black at nighttime. And the street lights are on. And he was obviously fascinated with being able to recreate this effect. It's now something that photographers seek out. They go out and they try to find what's called the blue hour. There are two blue hours, actually. There's one when the sun sets, and there's another one just before the sun rises. And they take photographs of the blue hour. But this would be a whole nother exhibition that hasn't been done yet of Brewer's blue hour etchings.
So hopefully you'll be able to get some exhibitions out there. And now that the authors are going out on the road again with book tours, you think any chance you'll be swinging this part of the state with a book tour down the road?
Well, what would be involved? Somebody wants to invite me, sure.
Okay, well, we'll have to make sure that happens because we'd sure love to see you.
Right.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we've been chatting with Ben Dunham, whose new book is called Etched in Memory, The Elevated Art of J. Alfred Brewer. It's available on Peacock Press, wherever you happen to go to find your books, independent booksellers, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever. Ben, come back in. I know that you summer out in Huntington quite a bit, so when you're out on the side of the state next summer, you want to come into the studio and do another show?
I'd love to do that, and I look forward to visiting the Athenaeum too.
Yeah, we'll get Guy will give you a great tour.
Yes,
we got a lot of room here on the walls. If you come into the studio, you can put up as many etchings as you like.
Right. We'll do a little mini exhibit right here in the studio. How's that sound?
If it's possible, I'm game.
Okay,
very good.
And that wraps up another edition of Athenaeum Spotlight. Ben Dunham has been our guest. Guy, it's always good to spend an hour chatting.
Enjoyed it.
Peter Coles has been our chief engineer. If you missed a part of today's program or you want to catch it again, it's archived on YouTube at WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. Catch us next week for another On the Mark, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks after that with more Athenaeum Spotlight. Have a good day.